On the agenda for today. So if you joined our first Test Planning Simplified webinar that was last month, you will have gotten a pretty deep dive into some of the different ways that you can take a more lean approach to test planning, and a more simple and therefore more agile approach. That webinar was led by our product manager, Simon Knight, who some of you may have seen in previous webinars. What I'm going to start with today is a quick recap of some of the information that he presented during that webinar, because I think it's a really helpful place for us to start. So if you've seen that before, we'll get through that in probably 10 minutes. If you haven't, then hopefully it'll be a helpful sort of framework to then talk more specifically about how you can approach test planning in a more simplified way using TestRail. And then the sort of most important part, I think, of this webinar is what you do when your plan gets punched in the mouth. We quoted Mike Tyson's often quoted as saying, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? So one of the key aspects to making your test planning more agile is trying to figure out what you do mid-sprint or mid-cycle so that you can keep moving ahead. Without further ado, let's jump into a recap of some of the principles behind a leaner approach to test planning. So one of the things that Simon talked about last month was this sort of heuristic. Test planning is a process that helps you answer questions. In particular, 5 questions, actually 6 questions. We've got the 6 W's, if you will. With test planning, we're trying to answer who's going to be doing testing, why are they testing, what are they testing, when are they going to start, when is the testing going to happen, how are they going to do it, and where is that going to take place? So that's sort of the fundamental launching off point. While it might seem a little bit simple to just use the sort of 6 W's as your test planning architecture, they're grounded in practice and in sort of more formalized test planning approaches, right? So here Simon had mapped on the 6 W's over the IEEE, which is the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers, their sort of recommended test plan structure, right? So you can take these 6 questions and break them down into the sort of smaller component parts that you might be more familiar with. The objective here, though, is we're trying to instead of starting with this very heavyweight framework, let's start with some of the more conceptual pieces that can give us a little bit more direction. It's similar to the whole agile idea, right? Of let's start with as simple of an approach as we can. Let's try to get a sense of the ground, a sense of the frame before we then go into details. And that way we're only adding the details that are absolutely necessary to get us to the next stage, instead of starting with this very robust and cumbersome list of details that we have to answer, right? It's taking that same kind of product iteration approach to our planning. Hopefully, the goal here is if you need to go into that detail, you can, but start higher level. Do sort of an initial round of answering just these very basic 6 W's, and then from there you can start to parse out, okay, where else do you need to go deeper in your test planning in order to make sure that you've got enough to work off of in terms of adequately planning and then executing. Another way that's become really popular to actually start to do the test planning, so once you've got that framework and that grounding, then you want to think about, okay, what's a good way for me to actually start to relate some of these answers to my 6 W's together? And in particular, Mindmaps have become a really popular tool in the software testing space over the last couple of years. I mean, there's a number of different folks who have written about how to use Mindmaps effectively around agile test planning. We've even published a blog ourselves about it, but there's a number of other super awesome folks, and all of these resources are things that we'll share with you after the webinar as well, so you can take a look at some of these articles more in depth. The idea here is you need to structure your thought process around test planning in whatever way makes most sense to you. So you'll see a couple examples here, but ultimately it's about what makes most sense to you as you're trying to quickly identify all of the different components that you may or may not need to be working through to make sure that you've got an adequate test plan. This is one example of a test plan that we've seen. This is another example of how you could start to piece together a mind map around a test plan, where you want to make sure you identify things like, why are you doing this? That might be your central node. Then it's going to be really important to define what's in scope. And here's a couple of those different sub branches that you might break that scoping area down into, whether it's in scope, and actually a lot of times it's just as important to define what's out of scope. And then as you're getting more in scope, are there functional requirements? Are there non-functional requirements that are more environment related or related to upgrading or downgrading? So this is a helpful place that you can start to sort of map out what you need to be thinking about when you're developing your test plan. And you'll see, as Simon had talked about in the webinar last month in more depth, all we're doing is we're taking that initial idea of the 6 W's and iterating on them, right? And getting to more depth. Depending on what kind of system you have under test, what kind of regulatory requirements you have, the complexity or maturity of the system, the number of moving parts, the number of different systems that might be integrated that you need to test, the number of different operating systems you're supporting, the number of people on your team, the number of different development branches that your dev team might be developing along at the same time that are all related to one release. This can get more complex. For example, Simon actually shared in the webinar last month, he shared a mind map that he developed for a testing plan for TestRail, and it got pretty detailed, right? Like, you can get into the weeds with these if you need to. The point is, start small and iterate out, because if you start with the complexity, you're probably going to miss something. You're going to get too in the weeds on areas where that might not be as important. This sort of structurally gives you a way to expand out and iterate in a more complex way as you need to, and then have that sort of gut check, right? That gut check of, okay, have I covered my bases here? Do I need to go in a little bit more depth? Does this document communicate what it needs to in order to help both me and my team actually make a plan for moving forward? The other thing that I'll say is the visual nature of a mind map is really helpful. And depending on what tools you use, there's a number of tools out there. I know Simon really likes to use Xmind. I've done a decent amount of work with Lucidchart in the past, as well as one of the sort of hot new tools in the block that's called Miro, M-I-R-O. That's nice and shareable. Depending on what platform you're using, you can make it shareable. You can make it collaborative. You can add comments. Each of the platforms has different sort of pros and cons. So I'll mention some of those as we go along if necessary. And I'll try to throw some of the different platforms that we've used in the slides when we send them out later. But those are just a couple of the tools that you could use that could then enable the planning process to actually be a collaborative team effort too, and not just something that is on one person's shoulders. Also, if y'all have any tools that you've used around mind mapping that you found particularly helpful, feel free to throw them in the chat or just send them as a Q&A to the team, and then I'll add those to the slides for folks when we send out the slides later too. So hopefully, I mean, that's a very quick crash course around mind maps. Some of you may already be using them. For some of you, that may have been the first introduction. Definitely something worth looking more into. Another visual tool that a lot of people have used in the testing space more recently is called the testing canvas. We've got a couple different screenshots here. I know they're kind of small, but of some of the different ways that folks have approached testing canvases. Canvases are used in a number of different applications. Another one that I've seen a lot is like a go-to-market canvas or a value proposition canvas. The idea here is you're collecting information in one screen so that you can see at a glance some of the different details that would fall into each of the different categories. There's going to be little differences in terms of what each box refers to, or the kind of information that's included in those boxes, depending on whose template you're using. The idea here is just what we wanted to do is share a couple of different ways that people approach it, and then ultimately you can decide what makes most sense for your team. If your team is in person, I've seen folks draw these up on whiteboards and use a whiteboard to do a sort of collaborative Canvas session. Another way that you could do this is you could break it down even in like a Google Slides. You could have, that wouldn't be necessarily that one pane of glass. That's one of the benefits of Canvas, but you could take this idea, right, and break it down into either each section gets a slide in a Google Slides, or there's also collaborative work tools, Miro being one of them, Lucidchart being another, where you could build out something like this and then collaborate on it together and give a lot of rich information, links, and that sort of thing. The key benefit of this is that you have that single pane of glass. And similar to mind mapping, both of these tools give you and your team a way to sort of start thinking about this holistically and collaborate on it, because one of the strengths of being human is being social and being able to work together. The other thing, yeah, and the actual framing of it isn't necessarily the most important part. This is all just to give you ideas for ways that you can break down the information that you need to collect in order to build your test plan, and some different ways that you might organize that information and collaborate on with your team. The last one that we're going to talk about in terms of like a planning tool is called a OnePage test plan. And Janet Gregory and Lisa Crispin are some awesome folks who have been contributing to the software testing space for a long time. I don't know if you've read their book, Agile Testing. That was one of the first that really sort of codified what it meant to do agile testing, not just agile development. And they're the ones that are most often attributed with the idea of this one-page test plan. Again, it's all just different ways to organize the information and thought tools, right? So one consistent theme that you're seeing in all of these different tools that we've shared so far is they all come back to those six questions, the 6 W's: what, when, why, who, and how. One thing I just wanted to share too, I think in particular around the scope question, because that's one that when Simon gave this more in-depth presentation last month, that he got some questions around, was around scope. And I think one of the most important things that you should talk about when you're discussing what's in scope and out of scope is, what does done actually look like, and what is your team's appetite for risk? Risk, the way that we think about risk at TestRail from a sort of a software testing approach, is risk is a threat to value. And so you want to think about defining what's in scope for the testing along the lines of both kind of what needs to be tested, but also what are the some areas of the threats to the value that your application brings. And I think this is also one of those unique inputs that the QA function has in the software development lifecycle. Dev and product are often thinking more about, they're thinking about value, but they're often oriented in a much more functional way. We need to get this out. What's the technical gizmo that gets us to be able to offer this new functionality? If they are sophisticated and a little bit more modern, they're also thinking about, is this usable? Not just is this functional, but is this usable? Does this actually solve the pain point that the user has in a way that's helpful for them? Because everybody knows, I mean, there's tons of products out here that purport to solve the problem, and the usability kind of kills whatever underlying benefit the functionality might have. But very few people talk about value to user in as consistent in a way as a QA team. And having the conversation about risk in context of scope is one of the ways that we can start that conversation in the software development life cycle, and ways that we can contribute to the conversation throughout the life cycle, right? Like you've seen this idea of continuous testing. A lot of times continuous testing is talked about in context of automation, but the more foundational way that QA participates in testing in sort of that continuous DevOps loop is by continuing to bring that conversation of value up along all the different stages of the software development lifecycle. So in particular, the way that we think about risk in practice is thinking about mapping risk to priority. And this is an image that I found helpful to think about some of that too. It's sort of like the drop in the bucket, right? Think about what's the highest risk. That's sort of your central, the most inner circle of that ripple that's created when you drop this new feature on your users, right? Like you want to make sure that the core things that the users use your application or your system for that provide them value, that those are working. So that's typically going to be in scope, like the core functionality. And then as you think about the decreased risk, it's another way that you can think about what risk is posed to your users is what level of value does that particular area of your application give to them, right? So like you may not have time to do full regression testing of every single little feature in your entire application. But if you can think about what are the areas that bring them the most value and test sort of from that central area outwards, that's typically a helpful way to think about defining risk and then assigning that risk a priority level in your testing. And then there's also different approaches to testing, right? One key way that you want to do this is with some kind of smoke tests, which might be exploratory depending on what terminology you're using. If you're launching new features, it may be important that you actually do a pretty thorough test of the functionality and you map the functionality from whatever requirements or user stories you had in a tool like Jira or a different requirements tracking tool to your test plan. And then there's obviously, you don't want to increase the number of bugs for the rest of the areas of the app just because you introduced a new feature, right? So this is where regression testing becomes super helpful. All of this idea around risk-based approach to testing assumes that you are working in a space where you can afford some level of risk. I guess that's the other thing to share is like, there are some folks who might be on this call who work in medical devices where they have a very detailed regulatory requirement around planning. I think the idea of starting with that sort of high level 6W question framework and then building out from there is still definitely valuable in that kind of scenario, but you might have to go all the way out to the very edges, the nodes of that mind map, and have a very clear detailed plan of what's going to be done because you're required to by the FDA or some other regulatory organization. So ultimately, this is here for you if it's helpful, if it's applicable, and but take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, understanding that ultimately your organization has unique challenges that only your organization has, and it's sort of like doesn't fit everybody, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a way to think about test planning that might not have been on your mind before. So that's sort of the quick and dirty. We'll share the link for Simon's presentation as part of the slides as well. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper into some of these slides, he gave a lot more helpful examples to him. He's been in testing for 10, 15 years now, right? So you can view that webinar replay if you want, but what I'm going to do now is shift gears a bit. I'm just going to check the Q&A too to see. Cool, okay. Nothing major's come up. Looks like we're doing okay. So what I want to do now is shift gears and talk a little bit more about how we can take some of those fundamental frameworks and ideas around agile testing and apply them with a test management tool like TestRail. So there's three main areas that we're going to talk through in TestRail where we're going to see some of these principles in action. We're going to start with milestones, and then we'll get to test cases. And in particular, I'm going to talk about some of the ways that you can organize test cases to help support some of this more agile planning, and the way that you can use fields and test cases with this as well. And then we'll talk about actually setting up some test runs and how you might think about test runs in TestRail to sort of build your test plan. So I'm going to go here. All right. So here we've got, actually, let's hop into the project overview page. Here we have my advanced messaging app. We are going to develop a very advanced messaging app today. I've put together sort of some dummy data. This again comes with the caveat of like, this is not an actual system under test. I imagine any of the folks on this call are going to look at that and say, this is the simplest test plan that they've ever seen. How could it be this simple? And you're right, because you're doing a lot of really important work in the field, and you're going to have to get a little bit more detail. But hopefully this gives you some ideas for how you could start to approach it for your own use cases. The first place that we're going to start is milestones. And this is one of the newer, milestones has been a feature in TestRail for a long time, but it's one of the ones that was sort of added on later. The way we think about milestones is they essentially are containers for aggregating test artifacts and information that you want to track in one place, sort of things that are related, different testing activities that are related to the same outcome. A lot of times, teams that use TestRail use milestones to connect with actual milestones in their requirements tool. Like if they're doing like more of a Scrum agile testing or agile development model in Jira, they'll actually line up whatever sprints are in Jira with sprints in TestRail. We've also seen teams do sub sprints to mirror the sprints in their Jira tool, or they'll even break it down a little bit further for the testing team's purposes and still have that sort of parent sprint matches to Jira, but then the sub sprints might be different. Another thing that we've seen is sometimes they'll do a milestone for a pull request. So if you've gotten it, the dev team's gotten to the point where they've actually submitted a pull request and now they want some testing on that in a sort of a staging environment, maybe that pull request is what you map to a milestone. And then one of the most obvious ones that we see people using milestones for is a release, right? So all of the testing that might be involved in getting to this big release, if you create a milestone and connect all of those test runs plans to that milestone, then you can see all of the different activities that you're going to do for that release. I've created a milestone already, but I'm going to hop over to the edit page just so you can see what it looks like when you create the milestone. You give it a name. If you're using TestRail, you may have used this references field before. This is a really helpful field because if you've integrated TestRail with your requirements manager, your defect tracker, and the most common one that teams use is Jira. That's why I keep referencing it, but there's a lot of other ones that teams use as well. If you integrate TestRail with it, when you enter an ID for one of the issues, so for example, let's say my Jira shortcode was IM and the epic that was related to this release was this number. If I've integrated with Jira, this is going to become a live link so that I can hover over it and see the status of the overall epic in Jira, as well as be able to save this hyperlink on that milestone to quickly open the relevant epic in Jira, if that's what you're using. You can also put a hyperlink here, like an actual explicit URL to wherever your requirements doc is. If it's a Google Doc or if it's saved in a shared folder or something like that, you could put that link here so that you've got it on hand for later. What I wanted to talk more specifically about, and the reason that we started with the milestone, is because this description field is a really helpful way to start implementing some of the frameworks and the tools that we saw in this introductory section of the webinar in TestRail. And in particular, it provides a great place to build out your one-page test plan. right? So you may start your one-page test plan in a Google Doc if you're trying to collaborate with that on with other folks on it first. But ultimately, it makes a lot of sense to then take that information and actually put it right here in the milestone. So you can work through all the different information that you might need to include. And that way, this key planning area is connected to that milestone from the very get-go, and you can constantly refer back to it as you're actually doing planning. Like, what was in scope? What was out of scope? What are we actually testing? What are we not testing? What did we say at the very beginning we were going to do around performance and load testing? Are we going to do automated testing in this this particular milestone or not? You probably are. If you're doing a more agile approach, you probably have some automated testing, but maybe you don't. This gives you a handy way to be able to refer back to that very quickly right within your actual test management tool. The other thing that's really helpful about milestones is that they give you a way to actually codify the timeline in your test management tool so that you can start to think about, okay, when is this actually happening? Am I planning resources accurately? And be able to convey that to other teams as you're going along. What this actually looks like, so most text fields in TestRail support Markdown. So you see here, we had that Markdown. So I've got these nice section headers. If I wanted to clearly outline the people in the role, I mean, I literally just adapted Lisa and Janet's version of the test plan, basically. Here it is, yeah, to what it might look like if you put it in a milestone. So you could fill all this out. That way you've got that as a handy reference. And then you've got all of the information that you're going to develop later on about what the plan is to achieve all of these objectives. They're all in context of one another. So that's how we would think about milestone. The other thing that I was just going to mention is you can add attachments to milestones. This is sort of a, or you will be able to in TestRail 7.1, which is coming out soon. You'll be able to add actual attachments. So if there's like a requirements doc, or if there's images or things like that that you want to add, you can do that there. All right, so that's milestones. Next, once you got your milestone in place, you got your overall framework, right? So think about this as like that first layer of nodes out from your mind map. Now let's get a little bit more detailed. Now let's actually start to write out, like, what are you going to test? And that's where you'd get into test cases. So in TestRail, a test case is basically a test idea, right? Like, this is defining ahead of time what you're actually going to test. There are some folks who have said recently, like, oh, we hate test cases. We don't, some folks in the software testing industry, some thought leaders or influencers, if you will, who have said we don't want test cases in an archaic form of testing, and we should do away with them. And there's something valuable to what they're saying about taking a little bit more dynamic approach to testing. Like, there's not as many teams these days that are setting a whole list of 1,000 test cases that they're going to test ahead of time. But the same idea of thinking about what you're doing before you do it, like, that's what a test case gives you the ability to do in software testing. It gives you the opportunity to actually outline what you're going to do before you then go do it. So for example, we've got our uber advanced messaging app here, right? I've broken down the different things that I might need to test related to my app into different sections. Typically, we recommend that you break your test cases down into sections based on feature or functionality. If your dev team is very component based, if you're heavily using the components part of Jira, you might use that here as well. You can also group these based on different custom fields. So for example, if I try to do, there's priority, I can also group them based on priority. So if you didn't want to use this sort of hierarchy, just the general folder hierarchy of a section, you could use one of those fields as well. But we've seen a lot of teams really appreciate having this this hierarchy that's based in sections. It's effectively like folders, right? This is something that a lot of folks say is really helpful about TestRail, especially compared to some of the other test management tools on the market. So this is where we typically say, like, typically you want to use sections and break them out by feature area. So there's going to be some prerequisites for me to even be able to test, right? Like things like, does the app even load on a mobile device? Can I even install it? Does it actually pull up the login screen when I open the app? I might have a login area. I assume for my messaging app, I'm going to have some contacts, and that's how I'm going to be able to store information like phone numbers for people that I want to send a message to. I've made the choice just for myself to break out within the login section, to break out some of the either smoke or functional testing that I might want to do around logins and my regressions, primarily because in this case, I'm assuming that I've set up some level of automation. And it's helpful for me to see sort of what are the key areas that are tied to value from a functional sense, and then what are the rest of the things that I might want to test if I have time, just to make sure I've got all my regressions checked off. You'll see I've added the column here for automation type. And in this sort of fictional advanced messaging app world, we are using Appium to do our app testing, to do some of our automated app testing, and I've also set the type to regression. Within the sections, you can add descriptions. So as you're, obviously I've already built out my test case framework here a little bit, but as you're going through and building out your sections, it can be a helpful thing to add some description here of like what this section actually refers to. And you can map from your mind map into some of these different sections depending on how you want to execute that. The other thing is you can filter these if you need to based on some of the different fields. So actually, let's take a look at, I've referred to a couple of these different fields a few times now, and I think it's helpful to dive in a little bit deeper on them because they really do help with the planning process. So one of the key things, we talked about risk-based approach to testing earlier, and I made the comment that ideally you should be mapping risk onto priority, right? Like you want that core inner circle of risk, the highest risk areas to your system delivering value to its end users. Those are the risks that you want to make sure that you're mitigating, that you want to make sure that you're testing first. We use the priority field in TestRail on test cases to capture that risk. You could set up your own custom field with a dropdown of high risk, medium risk, low risk if you really wanted to, but often this priority field is a helpful stand-in. You can change these entries in the priority field as well. That's a customization that you're able to do. The default is critical, high, medium, low. And so this is going to be a key way that you can start to build your test plan out. So you've got these different areas of your app that are high risk. As you write in some things that you need to test about them by using this test case architecture, make sure that you're capturing the level of risk associated with that area of the app that you're testing in the priority field on that test case. You can also capture things like what type of testing it is. Again, these are all customizable, but if, for example, if you're going to take an approach of, okay, before I test anything else and think about all the regressions and the functional testing, like first of all, the highest risk area to my app, the thing that delivers value is that my app has to be able to be installed and run, right? So you might start with that as the sort of smoke test, and then think about doing more like in-depth functional testing or exploratory testing. And it may be helpful to actually capture ahead of time what type of testing approach you're going to take with this particular test case as you then start to think about actually planning that test case in practice. Some teams are using a branch-based development approach too, where you might have, related to release, you might have 2 or 3 different branches that the developers are using. Maybe it's one branch is a front-end branch, the other one is code related to a back-end system that you need to test in a different way. So you can add any of these custom fields here. I've also added an environment custom field because there are some times where you need to test something in particular on one environment that may not be applicable to another environment. You could call that out here in the test case itself. And one other thing, as you're starting to get into test cases, this isn't totally related to planning, but it's a helpful way to set yourself up for the actual test execution. Test templates are really helpful ways to guide your testing. The default template for most TestRail instances is this test case text template, where it gives you this preconditions field, a steps field, and an expected result, but gives you free reign to put whatever text or images. It supports Markdown text, so you can get fancy with the text, or you just throw images in there, or whatever you need to, images, files, whatever you need to. A lot of teams also like to script out more thorough, organized steps that you need to do in a test. And then we've also got the built-in exploratory session where you might define your mission or charter in this field, and then what the goals are for that exploratory test too. So there's a couple different ways that you might think about organizing your test cases so that when it actually comes to planning, what are you going to test first and what's the different priority, you can filter off some of these fields. The other thing to note here too, just a sort of helpful thing to keep in the back of your mind, as a tester or somebody who's responsible for QA, your job is to find the most important problems as quickly as possible. So with that, let's talk a little bit more about how you might sequence some of this testing, right? As the final stage of your test planning, you've gotten the framework, you've done the investigation, you've built out the answers to the 5 or 6 W's, right? You've started to sequence out, okay, what are the resources I need to have access to? What are the environments? What amount of, are we gonna do any kind of load testing? Is that important or not? You've started to build out your test cases. What are the things that you actually need to be testing? On each individual level, you've assigned some level of priority and type. Now let's think about actually putting together the plan for what comes first and who's gonna do it. So with that, we're going to, I'll go ahead and save this, and we're gonna go talk about some test runs. The way that TestRail works, test cases are used to outline what do you actually need to test, primarily because it becomes really helpful to then be able to run the same test multiple times, right? Like if it fails, then you want to run the same test to see if it succeeds. Test runs are used to take those test cases and then actually test them. So I've put together a couple different types of runs here, and I've ordered them in priority. The way that TestRail works in the test runs area, or even in the milestones area, you'll see the same because I've attached these to the milestones for my fictional sprint number 4. It orders them alphabetically, so I'm just sort of hard coding the priority that I want to run these test runs by doing the 1, 2, 3, right? So if my job as tester is to find the most important problems as quickly as possible, the first thing that I'm probably going to want to do is run some smoke test to see if I can even get the darn thing to work, right? Like assuming that we had this messaging app was working before we added whatever new feature added. And in this particular case, let's say we're adding the ability to send messages that have images attached. So before, the system supported being able to actually have an app on your phone, log in, sign in, see your contacts, and actually send them a message. We don't want any of that to break. You can get more detailed with all of the different aggressions around all the different features that were included in those different areas. But first and foremost, can you even load the app? Like with the new code on it, does it even load? You might do that with an automated system, but sometimes it's easy and quick to just do it with like a test device that you have, or if you're using a simulated test device. And in that, thinking about starting with that inner circle from that drop, right, and then moving outward, be crafty with how you define where you want to start, right? So for example, Android currently supports 4 different versions of Android, plus there's Android 12, which is pre-supported. So you're probably going to want to test your new feature functionality for any of those versions of Android that your organization intends to support. However, Android 11 is the most common, and it's the latest stable version, and it's the most common among the Android devices right now. So for my first series of smoke tests, I'm going to want to do probably just like the key core functionality for each of the areas of my app that bring my users value. And I'm going to start just by testing on Android 11. Later on, I can do regression tests against all the other different types of Android versions. But if the new app doesn't even work on the most widely used version of Android, then it doesn't really matter if it works on Android 10. Like if there's that core functionality missing there, it's most important to flag that first and then come to maybe some of the other edge cases. You will need to get to edge cases most likely, but start with the most common, or a lot of times the phrase that's used to talk about this is the happy path. So you start with the most common, the highest risk areas, the most number of users affected, and grow out from there. Just so you can see how I put this together too. So you can add a test run. You get a default name here. If there's a particular epic or user story in your Jira board that relates to this particular functionality, and you could add that here, although this is a smoke test for some general functionality, so this probably wouldn't line up with specific requirements in your user stories or your requirements. But we've created that milestone already, so I can link it there. If I need to add description, I can, but this is where I selected first and foremost, and actually what I did when I created that initial test run was I went to priority. This is why we set that before, right? And instead of me having to make the decision right now as I'm creating this test run about what's the highest priority or not, what do I actually need to test or not, and what do I need to test first, I made those decisions on a case-by-case basis when I was thinking about the actual things I needed to test themselves when I was writing those test cases. Now it becomes really easy for me. I've already done that thinking. Now I can just filter based on critical test cases, and it's going to automatically select the cases that I had marked as critical, and I'm going to add those to this test run. Right? So this looks a lot like what I just added before. Another thing that I wanted to show real quick, if you're doing mobile app development, it's going to be pretty key that you're testing on multiple systems. And that's what we built test plans for. It's sort of a misnomer because you can, it's sort of like the Russian dolls, right? Where like a test run lives within a test plan. A test plan can actually contain multiple test runs. And then a milestone is the biggest sort of containing boundary area where you can have multiple test runs and or test plans in a milestone, just depending on how you want to architect things and what makes most sense in terms of breaking out what level of information you need at what level of detail. The key difference though about a test plan is if I create a test plan and then I add some runs to it, let's say, again, I want to do that critical smoke testing as the first thing that I'm going to do. Instead of having to add multiple test runs one at a time for the different configurations that I might need to test or different variables that I might need to test around, I can save a list of configurations that then I would select here. So for example, to create that initial round of smoke testing, I just selected Android 11 and iOS 12 because, well, actually, I think I selected iOS 14 because that's the most, at this stage, a lot of folks are on iOS 14 probably with the auto updates. So that way you can quickly put together the test plan that covers your bases in terms of the different systems that you might need to test. You can do whatever, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to go on from that. You can add whatever configurations you want to, by the way. You can change the name of this. You can add or remove any of these. I mean, this is all up to you, right? So whatever if you need to run the same test against multiple different scenarios or environments, this can be a helpful way to do that with test plans. Otherwise, you can just use test runs. So the idea here, right, was start with that inner, the area of highest risk, and then test outward. So I set up this critical smoke test. The other, then as the sort of second level, I created a test run that only has one test case in it, which might look a little funny, but in this case, it's an exploratory test. So I might not need a whole list of test cases in a test run. I might just want to set up a separate test run that specifically calls out that I'm going to do some exploratory testing. And if I set up the template correctly, when I go to add a result here, I'll see some of the details that I had added about, well, I didn't actually add the details about what my charter and what my goals were for this. That's why we're not seeing here, but I'll see that information in that format here, and then I can add comments as I go along. I can attach screenshots, I can attach screen videos, and ultimately I can mark the test as passed or failed if that's what I need to do to show that this is done. Then I might think about expanding outwards even further, right? Like there might be multiple branches that I want to test against, and the things to test might depend on which branch you're on, right? So in this case, let's see, this is that's by the back end. Let's look at the front end branch. So let's say that there's a front end team that's doing some development on the actual in-app sort of functionality. If I click here, does it open up this other area? Can I actually add an image from one of the sources of images on my device? Does it actually load into the messages pane? In this case, it might be helpful to call out the fact that this testing is going to have to get done against this branch. And you can add this as a custom field in the test cases too if you want to give that contextual information in place. Whereas if I'm testing some of the more back-end related functionality, like how the actual like networking works to send the message, like that's way above my technical level. I think I called this test case. If anybody in this webinar actually knows anything about networking of sending image files, you might be able to give more descriptive test cases here than I was. But you can separate out into those different areas that you need to test, and that way you can start to build out this test run that's going to be dedicated to this dev branch, so that you know, okay, for me to be able to run this, I've got to set up my system to have the code checked out from that branch. It also gives you a way to test while things are in flight, right? So if your dev team is actively working on the dev branch, they've got a stable release in the dev branch, but they haven't gone through all the process of merging it back into master. This way you can actually test that functionality a little bit earlier on around that specific functional area while the devs figure out, okay, how are they actually going to get all this stuff to sync back together? And then once it's actually synced back together on a master branch, that's maybe when you want to kick off your automated regressions. In this case, as I mentioned earlier, in this fictional case, we're using Appium, and I went ahead and said, okay, for the automated test cases, we're definitely going to want, in this case, to check all of the different stable platforms that are supported. We have a couple other webinars about how you can integrate TestRail with your automation. Typically, what we see is people will kick off test automation during their CI/CD pipelines, and they will add a task in their CI/CD pipeline to parse the results from whatever the results file was from your test automation framework and send those results via a bulk API call to TestRail, so that you can actually see the status of these regression tests that you're running in your automation within your test management tool, because you're trying to answer all these questions about like how you're going to test, who's going to test, when is it happening. But as you start actually getting into running the test, you're going to need to say, okay, how's my progress? Are we on track based on what the plan was initially? Are we off track? If you actually integrate your automated testing to post those results, that'll give you a much clearer picture and that sort of single pane of glass to say, are we is everything going according to plan, or do we need to change things up? So with that, I know we're pretty close to done, and I do want to get to questions if we have any, but I just wanted to come to the third and final point of conversation, which is that your plan's never going to go the way that you expect it to. Even taking a more agile approach where you're iterating and not necessarily going in as much depth, you're sort of adding more pieces to the puzzle as you're going along. Maybe you're adding more test cases, adding more test runs. As you identify there's actually more that you need to be adding in, you're going to get punched in the mouth. So how can you think about adjusting your plans mid-sprint? The first thing is, don't stop planning just because you started your sprint. It's really good to adopt a practice of continuing to check in on the initial plan. What were the goals? What were the desired outcomes? And are you on track for that? Is the testing that you're doing actually meeting those, or do you need to change priorities? Do you need to pause somewhere, pick something else up? Constantly use that framework of what am I testing? Why am I testing it? How am I testing it? As the backdrop as you're continuing through your testing cycle. Another thing that's really helpful is using an actual test management tool for your test execution. Because if you build your plan out in the test management tool and then now you're executing around that plan, you can use either real time. I mean, all of these pie charts are gray right now because I haven't started any testing, but once the sprint starts and I've started to actually test the system under test and add results, I'll start to see this real-time example of, okay, I've got some stuff done, but I've still got a lot left to do. There's also reports. So this was one that I had created earlier. It's not going to show that test that I had just passed because I created this earlier today, 4:40 p.m. Central European time, which, like this, for example, this milestone summary report is going to show me what my initial test objectives were, my initial one-page test plan, plus all the test runs and plans that I had added within that milestone. If I've actually been doing any testing, what the activity was, and then even specifically, what are the different tests that were in these different runs that I had queued, what was the priority that I assigned to them, et cetera. You can use this report either within TestRail. You can create a similar report to rerun and update that report. So I'll just do that real quick in the background. Everyone's got access, cool. So that way you can rerun that report. You can also download this as a PDF or HTML and share it with other folks on the team that might need a status update. But that's one of the key things. So we've got there's no pie emoji. So I'm in Brooklyn right now, so I'm using the pizza pie emoji. So use those tools to help you gut check where you're at. The other thing is, don't be afraid to change course. Like, you might identify mid-testing that there's actually a much more significant area of risk around the upgrade process for deploying this new feature functionality than you had anticipated. Don't be afraid to update your test cases or to change the priority on your test runs to reflect the new information, the new data that you have about that risk. If you keep asking the what, when, why, how questions and continue to wear that risk-based approach hat throughout your testing, you'll be able to identify what actually needs to get tested to make sure that you, as the tester, are constantly oriented around answering that question, like what's the biggest problem that I can find in the quickest way possible, and then alert the team so that we can collaboratively work to resolve it and continue delivering that high level of quality and value to our users. And this is just another point that goes along with that, like communication. I have this as a sub-bullet under don't be afraid to change course. Really, this is a sub-bullet for everything that we've talked about today. Communication is quintessential. Being able to communicate not only with your team, but other key stakeholders across the organization, dev managers, developers themselves, product team, delivery team, business analysts, the business itself, testing often, the testing function often gets put in this situation where there's a lot of pressure on the QA team to deliver, and usually there's not enough time given to it, and not enough importance has been put on it from the rest of the team. Everybody just wants it to be done and out, but like, stand tall and communicate about what you need, and always be framing it around that question of value to users. The purpose of testing is not to find every little detail that's wrong, right? The purpose of testing is to be your organization's biggest advocate for the users, and that's like a very important role. So don't be afraid to speak up and communicate about the status, and ask for input too, right? Like, you may see something that looks like a major issue in the app, but in communication with the customer support team, turns out that like they never hear about customers using this area of the app anyway. So maybe we can accept the level of risk associated with a bug in that part of the app that as a tester or a developer looks broken, right? But maybe the value to the user isn't as high, so maybe the risk is a little bit lower to deploying that and then fixing it in a bug fix in a later sprint or something like that. So all of that to say, in summary, use the 5 W's, 6 if you include how. Keep those questions in mind throughout the planning and execution process. There's a couple different ways that you can collaborate and build out the test plan, and then start to think about actually building that test plan into a more executable format and updating that test plan as you're going along. And obviously, keep calm and use TestRail, and drink water. It's very important to stay hydrated.